I'm Cindy Kelly. It is January 27th, 2015. I am in Santa Fe with Richard Yalman. And the first question I have for you is to say your name and spell it.
My name is Richard George Yalman. That's Y-A-L-M-A-N.
Perfect. Very good. We have, Richard has a very interesting story to tell about his days in the Manhattan Project. But to put it in context, we want him to start with his birthday, where he was born, and something about his childhood.
I was born on April 16th, 1923, in Indianapolis, Indiana. But by the age of 5, my father had moved to Columbus, Ohio. Actually, it was Bexley. Bexley is a little town surrounded by Columbus. It was a population of 5,000 then. It's 5,000 now. I went to the Bexley schools, and in high school, I used to hang around the chemistry laboratories at the Ohio State University. And in the summer, the chemistry acting chairman was a man by the name of W. Conrad Fernelius. And he thought I was pretty smart because I solved a geometric problem that one of his graduate students was working on. And as a result of letters of reference and whatnot, I got a scholarship to Harvard. And I went to Harvard when I was about 17. And by the time I was about 20, I was already into my master's program. When I suddenly get a call from W. Conrad Fernelius, who is now working in Dayton, Ohio, and he said, "Dick, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm a graduate assistant, but I'm only 20, and I will be drafted any day now." He said to me, "Well, if you come work for us, we can't keep you from being graduated, but it's an important project, and we might get you reassigned." So I went to work for them in Dayton, Ohio for 2 months, and I got drafted. And I was in Claiborne, Louisiana, doing basic training when I got reassigned to Dayton, Ohio.
So how was that? How did that happen?
He was looking for people to work on a project. And he was an inorganic chemist. And what he was looking for were just people who probably knew the difference between nitric acid and sodium hydroxide. And I had enough chemistry to know the difference. And he was trying to get people to work on this project, and he mainly got people he knew, former graduate students, current graduate students, students of professors from the chemistry department. They were all from Ohio State. When I got to Dayton, Ohio, I found that there was a man by the name of Ed Larson. There was a man by the name of Louis Marchi, a man by the name of Staniforth. These were people, there was Joe Burbage, who later became director of Unit 4 in Dayton. These were people I had known when I was in high school, because they were still they would take a master's degree by going to Ohio State during the summer. And most of them were high school teachers. And so they taught school in the winter, went to Ohio State during the summer. Other people I got to know, a very good friend was Henry Cuivla. That's K-U-I even I can't remember, Kuivila, Kuivila. He was an organic chemist from Ohio State. And they teamed me up with Henry. Henry was about 6 years older than I was. And he was married but didn't have a family yet. Other people who were there in Dayton, a man by the name of Sergio De Benedetti. De Benedetti had been a cosmic physicist in Italy. And he had already been gotten out of Italy, and here he was at the Dayton project. And I was told not to mention his name to anybody because people knew what he did in Italy, and therefore they had a good idea where he would be working in the United States. A man by the name of Swerbley was in charge of health at that time. He was the one who provided and analyzed the dosimeters. Let me think of, a man by the name of Lum, L-U-M, he was in charge of the Dayton project. I got there in March of 1944, and Lum was in charge of the overall project. He had been this was before Thomas Hockwalt Laboratories was taken over by Monsanto. So Lum had been a Hockwalt Thomas employee, and since this was under contract with them, they made Lum the overall director of the Dayton project at that time. Fernelius was in charge of the chemistry program. And so he fit me into that. Another chemist who was there, I think he was from Illinois at the time, a man by the name of Carl Rollinson. And that's all I think I can remember of the men who were already there. And they were all senior to me. Oh, when I was there 2 months, I got drafted. Went to basic training. I got reassigned. And by coincidence, the master sergeant, the warrant officer, responsible for signing my reassignment papers, later showed up in Santa Fe, and I got to know him socially after I got to Santa Fe. I can't remember his name now. I haven't seen him in 30 years. But I did run into him. He said, "Oh, I didn't know what you were doing, but I knew it was important." He said, "I signed papers for a lot of fellows like you, young people who were technically trained, but obviously couldn't avoid the draft because they were all under 22. When I got reassigned to Dayton, I was a private in the Army. There were at that time 7 of us. This is June 1944. Prior to the reassignment, there had only been one Army person at the Dayton project, and he was a sergeant, and he was in charge of communication. And that's what he did for the next couple of years. I was there, one of 7, for almost a full year. Oh, maybe not quite, but nearly a full year. It was a rather odd experience. I worked as a civilian. I did not wear the uniform. I did not have any Army privileges except for franking privileges. And that was because my return address was a P.O. box someplace. As a civilian, we were told not to wear any part, as an Army personnel, but on this project, we were told not to wear any part of civilian clothes. If we did, we would get transferred or jailed or what have you. Occasionally that broke down. Sam Jones, another young chemist like myself, went rowing one day in uniform in a nearby lake, and he was picked up, and he was broken from sergeant back to private with the admonition that he was lucky he wasn't being shipped to the Pacific. Another man, his name was Paul Hamilton. Paul's wife joined a women's group at Thomas Hawkwalt, and she said to them, "Oh, my husband has a very important job." Paul was told to shut his wife up. She was not to mention anything about being an important job. Another man was caught wearing his suntans one time, and I forget, he was just reprimanded. One time I wore, let me tell you back. Another odd thing that happened was our company headquarters was Chicago. So we were 7 enlisted men with no officers. And we got to the point where, and of course we couldn't salute while we were in civilian clothes, so that didn't bother us. We could go to get furloughs, and we were all uniform on furlough, but we had to go to the train station and change clothes. And we had to have an Army pass, a furlough pass. So I went to my wife's graduation from Swarthmore at the end of one year, and I can remember changing my clothes at Union Station in Dayton, getting on the train, going to Philadelphia, getting off the train in Philadelphia, stopped by an MP, but fortunately I had the correct papers saying that I was a furlough. Another odd thing was, although we were in civilian clothes, we could go out to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This was in Fairborn, Ohio, about 10 miles from Dayton. As we went out, on the right side of the road was the medical corps. On the left side was the experimental and mechanical and PX and prisoners of war and what have you. On the right side, we had to go monthly for a monthly inspection. We could go to the dental clinic and go to the medical clinic, and we do that in civilian clothes. When we went on the left side to the PX, we had to be in uniform. So eventually, after I'd been there about 6 months, a man by the name of Ralph Meinz was assigned to the project. Ralph was a captain in the Engineer Corps, but he was in a different company. So none of us would salute him. He could not reprimand us, apparently. It's because of this strict Army chain of command. So he was not our commanding officer. At one time I roomed with Ralph. Ralph was out of Oak Ridge. He must have done some, we heard he had worked in in a poison gas system, setting up plants. That might have just been the story. He might have worked for the project down in Oak Ridge. Anyway, Ralph was able to get us to the PX. Before he came, we couldn't go to the PX, and so he was really nice that way. But we'd go to the PX, and he'd be surrounded by a gang of 8 or so at that time. And we never saluted him. We never saluted officers on the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This clearly annoyed the ones that we passed, particularly if they were accompanied by a young woman. But we could go to the PX, and what we would do is one of the fellows had a car, we could drive out in the country, change our clothes, and go on to the PX. We come back from the PX, we change our clothes before we got back into Dayton, Ohio. It seems rather odd at the time, but this is what we did. My wife, the wives would go with the men to the PX, as the wives could buy the groceries there. And my wife at that time would see a piece of meat and she'd say, "Oh, that's a nice piece of meat." And she'd ask the butcher then what she did with it, how to cook it. And she learned her meat cooking from the butchers at the PX and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We all belonged to the Manhattan District Corps of Engineers. That was the aegis under which we worked. All of our identification, Army identification, such as furlough passes and so forth, identified us as being belonging to the Manhattan District Engineer Corps. I got married in Dayton, Ohio. Sort of an interesting story. My wife was from Manhattan, New York. She went to Swarthmore. Her folks were really rather upset when we got engaged, as she would get engaged to a man who lived way out in Ohio. They thought this was still Indian territory. And she came to visit for 3 weeks towards the end of the summer of 1944. Let me back up. I was at Harvard when I got my phone call from Cornelius asking if I'd be on this special project. And I went by way of Swarthmore from Cambridge to Dayton, Ohio. And I dated my wife. And I remember taking a walk with her in Crum Woods at Swarthmore. And she was sitting on a log. And I knew that she had several boyfriends. And I wanted to know whether I was still in the running. And she said, "Yes, I'm engaged." I said, "To whom?" And she said, "You." So I got engaged on the way out to Dayton, Ohio. It was a rather sort of a romantic thing, I presume. Well, I met her the previous summer. In the summer of '43, she went to Radcliffe for summer school. She had been at Swarthmore for a full year, and she sort of tired of it, and she decided to go to Radcliffe during the summer. Well, she met some men, and they'd get her name, and I was given her name as a blind date, or just given her name. So I called her for a blind date. At that time, we used to have a little radio station at the school, and on Wednesday nights, just play a piece, and there would be call-ins. And the first person who called in and identified the piece could get the name of a girl from Radcliffe, and he could ask her for a date. And I had 3 roommates. One roommate, they knew I couldn't hear. I couldn't recognize anything. But one of the boys, his father was a well-known Broadway producer of musical comedies, Adolph Green. And the son knew everything about music. I mean, you just hit a note and he actually knew what it was. So the son would identify the piece. Another boy would have 6 digits already on the phone, and as soon as the fellow identified the piece, off came the 7th digit, and they would let me make the date. And I would say things like, well, we'd like to go on a scavenger hunt. Would you like to go? And they said, yes. I said, well, bring a raincoat and bring a flashlight. And I already enumerated a number of things. And I'd then made the date, and I'd go up to Radcliffe and pick the girl up. And I can remember we went into the theater. The girl said, I thought we were going on a scavenger hunt. I said, we are. We now have to hunt for seats. So that was the kind of fellow I was, I guess. So I get this name of my wife, future wife, name was Joan Osterman, Osterman. And I made a date with her by phone to go to a dance on Saturday night. It was at Adam's house at Harvard. But on Wednesday, I decided to go take a look at her because maybe between Wednesday and Saturday, I might get sick. So I went up to Radcliffe, and she was in a dormitory, and I called on her, and she came down, and I looked at her, and I thought, well, this is great. And we talked a little bit, and she asked me how come I was there, and I said, well, I was just passing by. Well, passing by was about half a mile out of my way. I was just passing by. I thought I'd stop then. So we went to a dance on Saturday night. So I dated her several times during the rest of the summer. I remember one time she had a cigarette in a long cigarette holder, which I made fun of, and she never did that again. Another time I took her to a dinner at a spaghetti house, and I can remember that she dropped some spaghetti on her skirt, made a mark that needed to be cleaned, and I thought, well, she's pretty relaxed about it. So anyway, I wrote my mother that I met a girl I was going to marry. She had violet eyes. Well, she didn't have violet eyes, she had brown eyes, but I wrote my mother. Anyway, I dated her between semesters. I went down to New York and dated her a couple of times. At New Year's, I invited her up. She was back at Swarthmore, but she was back at Swarthmore. I invited her up to Cambridge for New Year's Eve. And I was very nervous. I got sick to the stomach, and I had a friend pick her up at South Station. My friend at that time was named Francis Whitfield. He was a junior fellow, known as a junior fellow at Harvard. He was an expert in Polish language. He later wrote the definitive Polish-English dictionary. He was a real linguist. He got a prize for something in Denmark. He decided he better learn Danish because he was going down 6 weeks. So within 6 weeks, he learned Danish. He was one of those just natural linguists. He later changed his name from Francis to Frank. He was went from Harvard to University of Michigan, and later on, my wife and I was teaching summer school at Michigan, and we were out at a recreation lake, and Joan sees Frank walking across the park grounds and yells out to him, and sure enough, it was Francis, and we renewed our acquaintanceship. Later on, he went to Berkeley, and one time I had a sabbatical at Berkeley and renewed our acquaintanceship again. So we kept up with Frank, and up until he died. when he was in the 80s. I thought of him always as an older brother. Frank must have been at least 4 years older than I was, maybe 6. But he treated me like a younger brother, and we had that kind of relationship. Getting back to my romance, in the summer, so I got engaged in March 1944 on my way to Dayton. At the end of the summer, Joan had a break between summer school and fall, and she came out to visit me in Dayton. Her family thought it was a good idea because they said if she saw me in a more natural setting, like the wilds of Ohio, she would certainly break up the engagement. And her uncle, in the meantime, had hired a detective to investigate me, see what kind of a person I really was. All this time, I had Q clearance from the Army and was working on the Manhattan Project. Well, they didn't know that, of course. They just thought I was doing something for the Army. Well, they knew I was in the Army because they knew I had been the basic training. But they didn't care about me, so that never bothered them. They never talked about it. My own folks lived in Columbus, which was only 70 miles away, and they had no idea what I was doing. So anyway, Joan came out for 3 weeks. I got her a room a block or two away from where I was staying. And of course, at the end of 2 weeks, we decided to get married. So I went down to I went and got a 3-day weekend pass. We went down to, we had to go down to the judge, get married, to get a marriage license. I forget the details, but we appeared before a municipal judge, and Joan had to state her age. Being very sophisticated, she said she was 21, because if you were under 21 in Ohio, you had to have your parents' permission, so particularly a girl. So she said she was 21. Then she got embarrassed because if she were 21, that meant her birthday was April 11th, that's right. And my birthday was April 16th. So if she were 21, she would be 5 days older than me. Well, my very sophisticated fiance almost broke things off at that point. She didn't want to be older than her spouse. We got the license, and we got married by a justice of the peace. His name, I'll think of it a little while, but he had a very famous name from New England. One of those names. It wasn't Thomas Paine, but it was a name like that, well known in New England history. When she came down from wherever she was staying on the streetcar, on the bus, and I can remember the dress she was wearing. It was a light print with sort of lace around the neck, like a dickie or something, but lace around the neck. And she was so excited, she told the woman next to her on the bus she was going downtown to get married. Well, we did. She got married by the justice of the peace. Cornelius acted as the man who gave her away. He was a leading man. Nancy Cueva was there with a sack of groceries. I can remember the celery sticking out. She and Henry had dinner for us. Henry and Nancy remained friends for years, and they were very nice to us. I think the Marchies were there, and the De Benedettis. Serge De Benedetti had married a young woman, and she became quite close to my wife. So we knew the De Benedettis quite well. Well, then Joan stayed, we got a room together on 7 Ivanhoe in Oakwood, Dayton, Ohio, suburb called Oakwood. And after a couple of weeks, her mother came to visit for a week. And then we went to Columbus, where my folks lived, and visited. So Joan went back to Swarthmore for a year. Her father said he wouldn't handle her tuition. She had to be on her own. And Joan said, okay, I'll just apply for a scholarship and tell him that you won't support me. Well, that embarrassed him so that he gave in and he took care of her needs for the next year. After when she graduated Swarthmore, I was there on a furlough pass, and I can remember graduation. Her immediate family was father, her mother, a younger sister, Helen, and her Uncle David, and her grandfather, Samuel Becker. Samuel Becker was he was a very nice old man. Looked like he weighed 110 pounds, thin as a rail. And I was joking with him. I said, Grandpa, what about your schnapps? He said, don't worry. He had a cane. His cane included an enclosed glass tube, which was filled with schnapps. So he had a schnapps, and I forget whether we went to dinner or whether it was in the station, but he was prepared. After graduation then, Joan came out to Dayton, and we had an apartment on Central Avenue, which was a very nice location in Dayton, Ohio. And we lived there until the end of the war. And then when the war was over, the war was over in August 1945, but I wasn't discharged until May 1946. I had not been overseas, had not seen combat, had not had special acknowledged assignments. I had no points, so I was one of the last people out of the service, discharged from service. But I was discharged in May 46, and then I went back to Harvard, took a master's and a doctorate in chemistry. We had our first child in June, that'd be June of 48. Well, back in Dayton, I got there in March, got reassigned in May. During the first approximately year I was in Dayton, I worked on chemical research. What Henry and I was trying to do was isolate polonium from radium residues which were shipped down from Canada. And we developed a process which was accepted, and when Unit 4 was made, a process for isolating polonium involved getting it in a solution from these ore residues, putting it into large tanks, what we call milking the tanks periodically. The polonium was then being produced, if I remember correctly, as a product of radium D. Radium D, if it shot out alpha particles, it went from its mass by 4 and its atomic number by 2. That would be about right. So the radium D, we had a lot of radium D, and its half-life was short enough that periodically we could isolate the polonium and then go back say, sometime later and remilk it. And we'd do that. And then the next year, while I was at Dayton, the first year, we were housed in a building called I forget the name, but I'll think of it. We were housed in a seminary school, Bone Break Seminary School. And it was built like a classical turn of the 19th century schoolhouse with the center well and the loud rooms off to the sides from the center well. It was very much like the school I went to when I was in elementary school, except that it was surrounded by barbed wire. It was situated off 3rd Avenue in Dayton in the middle of a white class, working class residential area. So so everybody in the neighborhood just figured it's another army war project. There was never any signs of army. There were never any signs of army personnel going in and out. It was later called Unit 3. Unit 1 was the original Thomas Hawkwald lab. Unit 2 was a place where they made picric acid for explosives. Unit 3 was the Manhattan Project. And while we were working at Unit 3, Unit 4 was built. Unit 4 was inside Hawkwald's family sports playhouse. This is the building which housed basketball courts, squash courts, exercise courts, whatever. And it was a classical gym, had a office with a glass window where anybody in the office could look down on the floor and see what was going on. Well, this was converted into a factory. Had something like 10 of these 10 or 20,000 gallon tanks where the radium D and the polonium were held. Part of why I was there was trying to develop the process for isolating with hydrochloric acid, but that didn't work out as well as the nitric acid process, I guess it was a sulfuric acid process. Anyway, during my second year out on the project, I was assigned to Unit 4. And I spent first part of my time working on process. The latter part of my time, particularly from around May or June on, was in the final purification of polonium for pits. So I didn't know what they were called at the time. All I knew is we had these small objects that we were to electroplate polonium onto, and we used to joke about them. One time we had an order, say, for 50 by a certain time. We'd joke and say, well, they're going down to General Groves so we can light up his desk at night. So we were...
Can you tell us a little bit about polonium for people who don't know anything about it?
Well, polonium, I don't remember much about polonium anymore. Polonium is in the periodic table with oxygen, sulfur, selenium, tellurium, polonium in that group. Polonium was an alpha emitter. And so the alpha emitters, I guess they hit the beryllium and knocked out the neutrons, and so they were a starter for the bomb. And there was a problem of condensation and emphasis, and so it was worked out, part of that was worked out by the name of a man, thermodynamicist by the name of Kistiakowsky. Well, I later learned that Kistiakowsky had been at Los Alamos. I didn't know that at the time. And he was later on my examining committee at Harvard. That was just coincidence. We didn't talk about the Manhattan Project. In fact, I never talked about what I did at the Manhattan Project until more recently when I went out to dinner with a man by the name of Truel West. We went out for breakfast one day, and Truel said, "Well, where were you during the war?" And I said, "I was in Dayton." "Oh," he said, "you worked on the pits." I said, "Truel." And I never, secrecy was so put into us in such detail, or such a way that the typical person never talked about what went on at the laboratory. It was only until I was in contact with the Heritage that I even learned there had been a spy at the laboratories during the summer of 1945. I learned that about a month ago.
George Koval?
Yes. And I didn't know him. He apparently was in the medical corps. Let me go back and say where Unit 4 was. Unit 4 was at the top of a hill going into Oakwood, which is a suburb of Dayton, Ohio. At the top of the hill were exclusive homes of people who had worked for National Cash and worked for Kettering and so forth. And this is where the Hawkwall Schoolhouse was. And you go into this building, and sure enough, it was just like a big gymnasium, multi-purpose gymnasium. And Joe Burbidge was the man who became in charge of the of Unit 4, as it was called. Burbidge is spelled B-U-R-B-A-G-E. He had been a high school chemistry teacher prior to the war. He was a big fella, very affable, got along well with people, and clearly was a very capable person. So I was at Unit 4 then doing a combination of research, process development, and final material development with polonium. We had a visit one time. Charlie Thomas must have been one of the visitors, and one of the Compton brothers, I think was Arthur Compton. I don't remember who the other 2 or 3 men were. But I remember the only remark I overheard was one of them saying, "Well, that amount of polonium, that corresponds to so many curies of radium." They were impressed by we had something like 15 curies of polonium per batch, I guess, that we were plating. And a curie was a measure of the amount of radiation. I think it corresponds to radiation produced by a gram of radium. And that was a measure of degree of radiation. So I was still in civilian clothes until October. 15 curies was a lot of radiation. That was probably the world's supply of radiation. Anyway, it was a lot of radiation. And we worked behind a glass barrier with what were called, we had these gloves.
Glove box? It was kind of a glove box?
Yeah, with a glove. People say that my memory's pretty good, but it's slipping. I can't remember words occasionally. We worked behind a glove box, apparently we never had personal radiation problems. Polonium had a we had a peculiar problem with polonium. As an alpha emitter, it had recoil, because if the energy goes out, you have to have energy going back so that the total net energy is zero. So just like a gun being fired, there's recoil. So the recoil then from polonium, if you have polonium recoil, other surrounding atoms would essentially jump. So it would be called creep. So if you put polonium in a beaker, next you come later on, around the beaker, there would be radiation effects. So it was very difficult to keep things clean, constantly cleaning up and trying to decontaminate the areas around the polonium. In the normal research, we worked with very low amounts, just literally detectable amounts, for health reasons, obviously, and also to preserve what polonium we had.
So all this time, even with low amounts, you were behind a glass shield?
Well, I wasn't behind in the glove box until we started making the pits. Prior to that, we worked in the open, but we worked with, fortunately, the alpha particles did not have a long distance of travel. In any case, we never worked, we did not work in glove boxes literally for this first year and a half, 2 years I was there. It was not until I got into the final stages where there was very large amounts of polonium that I got to the glove box stage.
So did you wear a dosimeter?
I wore dosimeters. I don't remember anything about the dosimeters of second year. The first year we were very conscious of it because it was all new to us, and the whole concept of what radiation might do was novel to everybody. And I can remember constantly having a dosimeter clipped to my pocket. Weekends we would take large flask homes, get 24 or 48-hour urine samples. To show you how secret it was, the first weekend that my wife lived with me, that I had to get a specimen, she said, "What's that for?" I said, "Oh, they want to see I don't have any, not getting any chemicals in me." Well, this was over the weekend. Monday night I come home and she says to me, "Are you working with radium?" She'd gone to the library and looked up what might require an overnight specimen. So she said, "Are you working with radium?" Well, that's how secret things were. Another time, in the summer, after I changed clothes out someplace in a farmyard, I still had my suntans on, and we lived in a 4-family house, and one of the other families was at Wright-Patterson, and the wife said to Joan, "I see your husband wore his suntans today. Is he in intelligence?" And my wife said yes. He was clearly clever enough to pick up on that, and said yes, he's in intelligence. No one's supposed to know he's around. So that was, and I never heard anything else about that.
When you use the term suntans, that's sort of like a khaki color?
The khaki suntans, they were the summer pants to the uniform. Another time, in the middle of the winter, when I was still at Unit 4, a very bad day, slushy, icy, and I wore my army boots instead of wearing regular shoes. And I used to hitchhike because the bus would take 45 minutes to an hour, and I'd get up. But I'd hitchhike from where I lived to Unit 4. One day I got picked up by a fella, and I said, well, just let me off at the top of the hill. And he did. He said, I got out of the car. Look, I know where you're going. Don't wear those boots again. Turned out he was in charge of security for the Dayton area. And he said, I don't care how bad the weather is, don't wear those boots again. And on the corner where I caught the bus, of course, there were other Army personnel, and one was a major, and I was in civilian clothes. But in October of 1945, we were told to go back into uniform. War had been over 2 months, and I guess by then reports began to come out and so forth. Well, I go back to my usual corner, and I'm now in uniform. I don't know what my major thought, but I know I didn't salute him. He probably thought I should, because I was still just an enlisted man. So those are typical of personnel incidents. Yeah, a lot of little things like that.
So in terms of these plutonium pits, you weren't told they were for an atomic bomb. What did you know?
Well, I knew it was part. I didn't know which part. I didn't know. They isolated Dayton very well, both information out and information in. This is the period 1944, 1946. I knew about Oak Ridge. I don't know if I knew about Hanford. I don't know if I knew about Los Alamos. I did know about Chicago, of course, because the work at Chicago had been known during the war, and during the early part of the war.
Had been known publicly?
Publicly.
And what? So did you know? Was it public that that Chicago Pile 1 happened, or?
Well, we knew about cyclotrons. We knew about piles. There was a book published. I took a course in atomic physics in 1942 or 3, probably 42 or 3. And the instructor's name was Oldenburg. Clearly he was this man who had been in atomic physics work in Germany, gotten out. We used a book called Atomic Physics. In the book, the next to last chapter, penultimate chapter, was concerned with fission and the amount of energy, the Meitner experiments, the Meitner interpretation of the amount of energy that was obtained when fission occurred. So that was public information. It was published by a well-known book company and so forth. This is one of those peculiar things. During the war, the second edition of the book, in the second edition, which came out shortly after the first edition, the second edition was published probably in 43 or 44. That chapter was omitted in the second edition. Another.
The first edition, I think you said 32 or 33. You meant 39?
The first edition, the Meitner contained the Meitner interpretation of the fission. And it talked about the work at Berkeley. I don't think it mentioned Chicago, but it certainly talked about the cyclotrons, what have you. The second edition excluded the Meitner interpretation. They were probably still talked about the cyclotrons, because that was pretty public. But the second edition had the chapter on fission and energy omitted. Another book which I used, which was somewhat like that, the separation process for polonium from radium pretty much followed qualitative analysis in inorganic chemistry. There was a book by Noyes and Bray entitled Qualitative Analysis, which I used as a textbook and essentially as a Bible for inorganic solution chemistry during my first year at graduate school in 1943-4, before I went to the project. And that book was published, I think, is in 1929. But by 1944, that book was no longer available because the material it contained were the types of laboratory procedures which were used for separation processes for radioactive elements. So things like that would happen. There would be that kind of censorship. Well, that was silly because if you're really interested, and you got two books and the chapter's omitted in the second edition, but it's there in the first edition, that must be an important chapter. That was, censors censor. They do not think, they censor. Anyway, that was, but I didn't know anything. I knew that Oak Ridge was active, and let me say this. After graduate school, my first job was with the Atomic Energy Commission, and I was on radioactive waste. And in particular, we were concerned with how do you clean up the Hanford, Washington mess? That was a major mess. And I had a couple of trips out to Hanford. So sometimes I find that I merge in my mind the periods. What did I know when? So when did I first learn about Hanford? I don't remember when I first learned. Or when did I first learn details about Oak Ridge? I don't remember because it's merged with all the other information I have.
Can you think why you might have known about Oak Ridge? What was the relationship between Oak Ridge and Dayton?
Well, we knew that our materials, I don't know how I knew that. I knew our materials went to Oak Ridge first. But what they did with them, I didn't know. I just knew that we sent this material down to Oak Ridge. And we knew it went down by courier, guarded courier, and we joke about it, but we didn't know what it was actually, how it was used at Oak Ridge. So clearly I didn't know much about Oak Ridge at the time.
I interviewed one of those couriers about a month ago.
One of their...
I interviewed someone who was a courier.
Oh, really?
Yes, he drove the special material from Oak
That's
Ridge to
interesting.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Yes. He later went on to found Waffle House.
Oh.
So you never know.
Never know. Yeah.
Never know. But he said that going to Dayton was very high security around Dayton. So, I mean, you've told us a lot about how they tried to keep things secret. Do you remember any other things about your experience with Dayton that would have made it very secret?
Well, I told you about never saying that the Benedetti was there. We just didn't talk about it. I remember being chewed out once. I put a solution in a large glass container, and I was said, Dick, you shouldn't have done that because that container is to go back eventually to the manufacturer, and it'll have radioactive even though we try to scrub it, it may have vestiges of radioactive material in it. I remember being chewed out for that. But other than just the emphasis on security, we had barbed wire and the guards and what have you, but never any mention of Army association. And I never encountered anyone who said to me on the street, for example, "You're a healthy-looking young man, how come you're not in the Army?" I never had that experience. As Sam Jones had, and he went rowing in uniform one time and got picked up and got busted back to private. I lived off base. I lived for the year Joan was back in school, I lived in rooms that I rented, something like $10 a week, probably included breakfast. And I have no real recollection of other than the emphasis on security, no incidents related to security.
I was going to ask you as to whether there were billboards or signs. It seems that they wouldn't have been, because your sites in Dayton were sort of in the middle of residential communities, right?
Yeah, it was in the middle of the community. There was nothing pointing to it, nothing. Well, there was, remember, outside of Dayton, 10 miles out of Fairborn, was this huge Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This, remember, was the base, one of the bases for B-22s. They were our B-2 for big bomber base, whatever they were at that time. So this was the thing in Dayton, was the Wright-Patterson. All the military in Dayton worked at Wright-Patterson, so that we were small peanuts. There was no reason to emphasize it. If they thought anything, maybe they thought this was something connected to Wright-Patterson, the Air Force, not Army. But I don't know if people, you get used to things. I don't know that people, local people, really paid any attention to us. I would walk from the streetcar line about 2 blocks to this place. And I remember never having anybody on the street say anything. It was just another government building working clearly on some war project. And to my knowledge, the only security I ran into was a few incidents like having the wrong shoes in the wintertime and wearing suntans. One boy got picked up at a grocery store wearing suntans, partial uniform, reprimanded. But the security, it's just that we were indoctrinated not to talk about. Oh yeah, the one boy whose wife says he has a very important job. That was it, and he was told to shut her up. What she did, that was Lee Hamilton's wife, and but the emphasis, there was no visual emphasis on security. There was no indoctrination in the sense that you go into a room and somebody does a point process and talk about it. It was just word of mouth. You got Cornelia said when I got there, "Now, Dick, don't talk about this." And it was clear that no one did. Now, four of the men, they got pretty bored with, or not bored, but they felt that they were getting away from what their first love was, in inorganic chemistry. So Cornelius Carl Rollinson, Ed Larson, Lou Marchi, they formed a group to study inorganic nomenclature. And they would meet weekly in the evenings and talk about inorganic nomenclature of a series of compounds called coordination compounds. And this was published 2 or 3 years after the war was over. And at my oral exam for my PhD, this article had just been published, and here I knew about this people, about this article. I knew the people who authored it, and the question was asked by Kistiakowsky, who clearly had met Fernelius. So, but this had nothing to do with security. This is 3 years later. So you were asking about security, and we were indoctrinated. We didn't talk. As far as I know, the local people, the people who actually worked on the process, never talked about it. We never talked about it socially. We were out with another couple. We never made a reference to it. And so it came as a complete surprise to me to learn that there had been a spy there. I didn't know that. I didn't know the person, and he was undoubtedly at Unit 3, where you could see all the records and all the reports, and I was over in Unit 4, and he was in a medical division. I can't remember anything about the medical relationship from the time when I went to Unit 4. Unit 3 I do, but not Unit 4. So you asked me about security, and all I can say is that they must have picked a group of very honorable people, and we didn't talk about it. We had these little incidents from time to time. We were kids. I was 20 when I went into the program. Older men were maybe 25 or 6. Fernelius he must have been late 30s, maybe 40 by then. He was an old man. Lum was a real old man. He was in his 40s. Ralph Mines was an engineer in charge of the process plant development. He was an old man, big fella, great big man. He must have been, he was married and had children. He must have been 40. Old man, 45, God. Unit 1 was Thomas Hockwald's laboratory. That's Charles Thomas, and Hockwald's name, first name I forget. But the very interesting thing about it, when I was at Unit 3, after a while, I forget how we had our lunches. I do know that there was a period when like a Subaru or little bus, pick up people from Unit 3 and take us over to Unit 1 where they had a cafeteria. We'd get our lunch over at Unit 1, and then they'd drive us back to Unit 3. Well, Unit 1 was the Thomas Hockwald Laboratories. And I remember I wasn't supposed to, but I'd visit people in the laboratories over there. Got to know a man by the name of Harris. Well, Harris was working on the equivalent of Tide at the time. I think Monsanto later on got in the business of making Tide, and that was based on research during the war over at Unit 1. So Unit 1 was a non-government laboratory. It was still a private laboratory. Units 2 and 3 and 4, those were under government contract, through government work. So I knew of Charles Thomas early on, and I'd seen him. I may have met him a couple of times, but only as passing by. I know he came to the laboratory in '45 when we were doing electrochemistry of polonium, came with that group. But that may have been the only time I actually saw him personally.
Did General Groves ever visit Dayton? General
Oh.
Groves?
Well, if he did, he didn't come down to my level. He may have visited them or Burbage or Fernelius. Uh, I don't think he was with the group that came to lab, but he might have. We were introduced to 5 people. I only remember Compton, and I think Thomas was there. I recognized Thomas, so clearly I'd seen him before. Whether Groves was that one of the 5, or I don't know. We were pretty far down the ladder. I remember when I first went to Dayton in the spring of '44, there were only 7 GIs there. Later on, by the time of the atom bomb in August '45, the number crept up to 30. One of the person, I don't think I mentioned that our company headquarters was Chicago. That was our company I was with. And one time a lieutenant and a master sergeant or warrant officer came down from Chicago and bought us all civilian clothes equivalent in value to what our uniform would have cost. Because we weren't issued uniforms. I didn't have a uniform. I had whatever I had during basic, but nothing else. And we went to a store called the Metropolitan, which was a men's store. It was on the corner of 5th and Main in Dayton, Ohio. And there was another man about my age and size. I can't remember his name. But my wife was with me, so she picked out the clothes for me, and she said, his name was Gunther. I can't remember his name. Oh, eventually remember Gunther something. Anyway, she said, you got the 2 best suits. Gunther got what's left. So I had 2 suits, a top coat, shoes, and a hat for $125. And that was my total connection with Chicago, with the officers in Chicago. I never saw them again, never heard from them again, never had any relationship to them again, because they were not involved in the science.
Yeah.
They were strictly officers, and they had their own company up in Chicago. They never came down again. By the end of the war, there were maybe a total of 30 of us. At the time of this incident I'm telling you about, I think there were still only the 7 of us who were originally there. And that was, again, one of those peculiar things that happened during service.
So we talked about the Smythe report.
Oh.
Tell us about that.
Well, when I got out of service, I never talked about what I did. I never even mentioned the word polonium until fairly recently. The Smythe report said, I'm paraphrasing, that polonium was made in Dayton. That's all it said, that there was polonium in Dayton, Ohio. Maybe it said, I don't know if they used the word production or not. It just said, and it just associated polonium with Dayton, and that was it in the Smythe report. It wasn't even a complete sentence, as I remember right. I've never seen Dayton, in one of the journals, I think it was the Journal of the American Chemical Society, one of the journals mentioned bismuth. I think one of the sources of polonium was the irradiation of bismuth in a pile. And the bismuth had to be very pure, and we knew it was made by a company in New Jersey. And our spent business went back to the company in New Jersey. And we never knew how they got rid of any radiation in the spent business. That was company secret. And I think that makes sense that if the business got hit by a neutron and ejected an electron, that would be converted to polonium. So maybe that became a source of polonium too, of polonium also. But people say, where were you during the war? And I'd say I worked in Manhattan District. And they'd look at me and I'd say, well, atom bomb. And they'd say, where? Oh, they'd say, you're at Los Alamos. That was always the response. And I'd say, no, I was at a place in Dayton, Ohio. I said, it's one of those small places that the Army had. And that's all I said for years. And whether others talked about it or not, I don't know. But it was indoctrinated into us not to talk about it, and I never did. For years and years and years, up until Truel. This was about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago. It was like, Truel, I said, I was in Dayton. Truel says, oh, you're working on pits. Well, who was Truel? Truel worked with, he was at Los Alamos for a while, and he worked on non-proliferation programs. So he knew a lot of the history of the project. Oh, yeah.
Wow. So how many were, if they're at the end of the war, 30 who were in the Manhattan District, how many were government?
Well, there couldn't have been very many more. I don't think the first group of civilians that were there when I came in March, I don't think they added any more civilians, or very few. And the Army were reassigned, the people reassigned by the Army all had technical training one way or another. So instead of adding civilians, they would reassign Army personnel. So I can't remember knowing, remember the name of Warmer was it. What was Warmer's first name? He was a very nice man. I roomed with him at one point. He was an older man. He was in his late 30s. He was a very old man. He had a wife and family over around Muncie, Indiana. I remember he took 2 weeks off one summer because they raised corn, and he had to go over and help in the corn cannery factory. It was.
So if there, would you guess 60 people altogether, or 100?
Oh, it must have been 60 at the most.
60
it was
at
a
the
small.
Most, including your 30 Army
Yeah,
people.
it was a small. Yes, it was a small unit. It was. I mean, you think of thousands, and no, we were a small unit, and that's why. I mean, this Bone Break. We only had these 2 buildings, Bone Break Seminary, which was the size of a typical elementary schoolhouse of the turn of the century, and Bone Break, and the Playhouse, which was a freestanding building, and nothing else. There was no Unit 5. There was no additions to any of these buildings. This was done in, this very important work was done in an extremely confined area, and yet it didn't seem crowded. There were very few of us. It was maybe there weren't even 30. I used the word 30. I don't know why I used the word 30. I can't identify more than 10 or so. There was Gunther Moore. Moore's last name. Gunther's last name was Moore. He was a soldier, one of the original 7. Sam Jones was one of the original 7. fellow by the name of Ben. He had the car, and he'd take us out, and we'd change our clothes. And one time I called him Sam by mistake, and he didn't like Sam Jones. Sam Jones was the Pitts, so we didn't like him for some reason. And when I called him Sam inadvertently, he was so irritated with me. There was Sam, there was Ben. There were two handsome engineers, tall, handsome fellows. And I don't remember their names. And they came after I did. They were out of the original 7. They came small. Get an idea, it was not big. The elementary school up there, that's much bigger than these places were. These were small. When mine's got 10 tanks in there, got the filter, that must have taken 2/3 of the space. And probably something went on, and this was in the major basketball court. Then I forget how the squash court was used. Mine's had an assistant engineer. He's an engineer. Or Burby, yeah, mine's had an engineer, I forget his name. And there was a man by the name of Martin, I think his first name was Don. He was a research internet chemist. He must have worked on volatilization. I remember his locker was next to mine at one time. Then there was, I haven't thought about most of these people in 70 years.
How did your experience on the Manhattan Project roll out, influence the rest of your life? What did you do after the Manhattan Project experience?
Well, I finished graduate school in chemistry. Then I worked for the Atomic Energy Commission. Oddly enough, at the Malm Laboratory, which is down Miamisburg, Ohio, which is also about 10 miles from Dayton. And I worked on radioactive waste. And I worked there 2 years. And we had a very nice garden apartment in Miamisburg. But my wife had a baby by then. So the radioactive waste project, the material that we had to work with was saturated sodium nitrate solution. The same nitrate that's in the drums that lose down in Carlsbad. There were 5 radioactive elements spread across all the chemical processes. And to get any one out of there would still leave the other 4 behind. No single process. And what you're trying to do is remove material which, from a chemist's point of view, is already in extremely small amounts. They may be large from a health point of view, but not from a chemistry point of view. And in 1950, the job was impossible. This is 2015. So we're only talking about 65 years later, and there has been no further development chemically beyond what we did in 1950. So I wanted to go into teaching, and one of the reasons I didn't initially was that the differences in salary between what I was offered at the Atomic Energy Commission and a teaching job was tremendous. But after 2 years at Miamisburg, I then decided to go back to teaching, to try teaching. And I heard there was an Antioch opening, and I knew about the work-study program at Antioch. And I'd had several years in the Army, which was essentially industrial chemistry. And I thought this is a very important part of education, to look at it from an industrial point of view, as well as the classroom point of view. So I went to Antioch to teach, and I taught there 33 years. In the summer, when I announced I was going to resign, I had something like a leave for 30 days or end of the month, whatever the period was, at which point I was taken off all the chemistry I'd been working on, sat down in the library and told that I no longer had clearance. In addition, before that happened, Consumers Reports was trying to get a foothold into the public, and they had a sale. If 5 people joined and took Consumers Reports, they got a 40% reduction in cost. So I put a notice on a bulletin board. Now you asked about size. Miami Laboratory was 900. It was tremendous compared to Dayton. 900, well, they did all sorts of things. Radioactive waste was just one part. But anyway, I put a notice on the bulletin board to try to get 4 other people. Out of 900, I got 2 others. Of the 2, one had a talking to by whoever is in charge of security at the Mountain Laboratory. He backed off. I ended up with only 1 other person. So I couldn't get a reduction in price. When I went to Antioch, security said to me, could you inform us on the people at Antioch? They might be communists over there. This is 1950, beginning of the McCarthy era. This gives you something, tells you something about the mentality of security at the Mound Laboratory in 1950. We had none of that at the laboratories in Dayton during the war. Of course, Russia was a ally at that time. But even then, we never even talked about politics. We were all there to work on, we knew we were working on the atom bomb. People say, did you know what you were working on? Oh yeah, we knew we were working on the atom bomb. We knew that much, we just didn't know, have information about the other installations. And we were all pretty dedicated because, remember 1943, 44, this is just before, well, in June 4th, 1944, we had Normandy landing. So this is pretty crucial. We all knew about German physicists and their capabilities. We were all concerned about, can we get there first? If Germany got a bomb before we did, that would be terrible. So we were all concerned about the historical importance, the war importance of what we were doing. In 45, people say, do you regret dropping a bomb on Japan? Well, in 45, we knew about Guadalcanal, we knew about Iwo Jima, we knew about Okinawa, we knew that if you try to land on the beaches of Japan, it would be worse than Normandy. Those people are going to do kamikaze. Every one of them is going to be a kamikaze. We knew that. It'd be just terrible. So we had no compunction about that ending the war was more important than landing on a beachhead in Japan. So we had people that I knew after the war, I never heard a word of regret. None of the people that I knew in Dayton ever said, we'll work for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They may have, but I didn't know of any. I never heard anybody talk about regrets. Later, I've had people come up to me when they heard that I worked in the Manhattan District and thank me. They say, we were just ready to disembark and you probably saved my life. I have had that happen. So you can't foresee the future very well. And even then, other things have happened that are unforeseen, and I have no regrets of that. I was going to tell you this, a guy by the name of Warner, he worked there. Another man was I think his name was Don Martin. He was a very old man, must have been middle 40s. He was an inorganic chemist. He worked on, I think he worked on the volatility of polonium. A man by the name of Satterthwaite, he worked in the lab where I worked on the electrochemistry. We had a group leader whose name I cannot remember. He had a PhD. He was in the Army. He was probably a sergeant. He already had his doctorate, but he was drafted. Satterthwaite. There's another man, name began with, also with S. He also worked on the volatility of polonium compounds. But Swerbley, I think, was the name of the man who was the medical director of Unit 3 at the time I came. There was a woman named Catherine. She was very close to Eichelberger.
So she was a chemist, Catherine?
She was with Mary Curtis, I thought, in electronic measurement. We would have our slide, like a microscope slide with our material on it for determining radiations. And she helped measure in the measurements. Had a little chamber, electronic chamber, and Catherine Mary Curtis. Then there was a woman who was secretary to Lum, and I don't remember her name. Her husband was, I don't know whether he was in the Pacific or what, but he came back in 44, he'd lost an arm. She was so thrilled to have him back. I don't remember any woman who was in the chemistry. De Benedetti had a man named John Sopka. That's S-O-P-K-A. John had, I think, a master's degree from Harvard. He got drafted. No, he was civilian. I don't know what he was. I don't know how he got there. Maybe someone told him about the project. I don't think he was in military. Then he went back to graduate school at Harvard. De Benedetti, Sopka, Eichelberger, they were physics, electronics. After I went to Unit 4, I could have, remember by that time, all the available men and women were pretty much technically placed who were available. I mean, no one's going to become available. And after the Battle of the Bulge, and around that time, that was 44-5, no man or woman who was technical would be available. So if you gathered them up early on, and remember the only reason I had these people is they were being deferred because they were teachers or research people someplace. So I think 3 and 4 never did get any much larger than what I can really identify. The small peanuts doing all that important work. They were very capable in terms of how you think about it. And we were working with small, highly radioactive small amounts in terms of mass, large amounts in terms of radiation. The other people, like Hanford and Oak Ridge, they had to start with mass of material and end up with fairly sizable quantities, but in the process they had to build very huge plants, essentially, processing plants. We had very small process. Imagine our largest tank was 10 or 20,000 gallons, something like that, maybe 10,000. So I think of Hanford had these storage tanks, what were they, 50,000 gallons or something, big tanks. We had nothing like that. So maybe 10,000 is too big. Remember, these 1, 2, 4, 5, 8 or 10 tanks fit into this gymnasium in a family sports center. Couldn't have been very big in terms of comparative size to Oak Ridge or Hanford. It's right in the middle of Dayton. And the Unit 4 is in the middle of Upper Crust Dayton. Interesting.
So what became of the playhouse when you were done?
The playhouse was torn down, and of course the dirt got removed and got filled in. I don't think, it may be a park now, I don't know what's there. There's no way, the building was so contaminated. The interesting thing is, I never heard of anybody who got contaminated. We may have, but we were very careful in an offhand way. We took home overnight, over weekend specimen bottles, flasks, what have you, once a month maybe, or whatever. For some reason, the second year, the health conditions elude me. I remember them very clearly the first year. By the second year, maybe it was a matter of fact, we just didn't pay any attention to it.
What about, you say the tanks, were they tanks like Hanford in that you stored waste in tanks, or you just used tanks for your experiments, or what were the tanks for?
The tanks?
Yeah.
They were probably glass-lined tanks for the solutions of radium-D, which are solutions which contain polonium, and the polonium was extracted from the solutions in the tanks. I think they used bismuth hydroxide, carry down polonium, and then to concentrate it, and then the polonium was extracted from gotten from the bismuth. Very interesting. Unit 3, there were some, when they came there, I don't know. Frank, Unit 3, by the time I came back from graduate school, Unit 3 was used at that time in polonium research but also is used to study how to decontaminate wastewater containing polonium. And the process they developed was very similar to the process which was used for extracting polonium during the war. And the name will come to me eventually. And they built a wastewater plant at Mount Laboratory, essentially based on the old process, but converted by wastewater equipment to upgrade it, modern process.
Wow.
Oh, Frank Mead was in charge of that process. Frank Mead. M-E-A-D. That was, but he was, I don't know where Frank was during the war. Now, whether he was already at Dayton when I was at Unit 4, I don't know. He might have been, I don't know. Frank Mead, M-E-A-D.
Yeah. So the only way you met people from another unit was you went to lunch at Unit 1.
Yeah, I went to lunch.
And did you see people from other units at that lunchtime, or how did you?
No. When they were doing that, when I was involved in that, we only went from Unit 3 to Unit 1. Unit 4 had not yet been, was not yet up and going.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember the first time I saw Unit 4, it's just an empty building. So I saw it, and then there was some space in one corner which we converted into a lab, and I think his name was Warner, I forget his first name. Staniforth was the man who worked on the volatility of polonium. And I can remember one time he had a tube which he had heated, and he got a condensate, dark condensate, and he was meticulous about putting all of his observations in a notebook. And I can remember signing as a witness to his observation. And he had a way of purification of polonium from down the last stages by volatility. Whether or not that was used at some stage ultimately in the purification process, I don't know. But, his name was Staniforth. I don't know his first name. I don't remember his first name. And his lab was down the basement. So you can see there wasn't a lot of space. Physics was up on the 3rd floor. Swerby had a corner. Eichenberger had a corner. Between the two of them, they had half of the 2nd floor. We had half the 2nd floor in chemistry. Below us was a room for mock-up. The guards must have had a room someplace. So not a lot of space in that building. And the same way with the playhouse. So maybe 30 altogether. Not in a big place. And of course, it's easy to keep, security was, as I say, internal security, local security, very good. And I didn't know about this joker who became a spy.
George Koval.
Yeah,
Yes.
we were very upset when we learned about, what's his name, out in Los Alamos.
Carl Fuchs, the spy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carl Fuchs,
Yeah. Fuchs.
Yeah.
Yeah. That upset us. But we didn't learn about that till after.
Right.
That English buddy system. But for a man to have been assigned to Dayton in medical meant that somebody else had to be in position to make the assignment. I mean, he just can't pick up and go from Oak Ridge to Dayton. Somebody had to transfer him. And I only read a brief thing in Wikipedia, and it didn't mention that somebody had to transfer him. As I said, the warrant officer, I was at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana for basic. So the warrant officer's name was something like Cervantes. Well, he could know that he was placing people around the country, continually placing people in spots. Somebody like that who could sign transfers, could assign this guy from moving from Oak Ridge but it had to be another party who could sign a transfer. As a chemist, although I worked in radiation chemistry for 2 years, when I left it, I didn't want to do radiation chemistry after that. But one of the things I saw is that the first year, the measuring equipment was always breaking down. A lot of trouble keeping the equipment going. Constantly breaking down for whatever the technical reasons were. I felt that Eichelberger, if that was his name, was constantly repairing so that we could use the equipment. And my thought was, I'm not an electronics man. I couldn't repair. I didn't want to have anything to do with the equipment. So I never did any radiation chemistry after that. The equipment, just too much. Well, by then, of course, the equipment was better, and you could begin handling it, but I just shied away from it because I considered bad experiences with equipment during the war. Never thought it would get to the point where anybody could handle it. I taught at Antioch 33 years. And I did a little research on the side. And one of my accomplishments, I synthesized a molecule called porphine, which is a circular large molecule. And it's found in hemoglobin and vitamin B12 and enzyme catalase. Is found biologically important, and that's why I studied it. But I stopped. That was around 1970. And when I left teaching, came out to Santa Fe, and my wife and I ran a little antique store for 25 years. And that was, I think we did it more for fun. As business people, we did everything wrong. Wrong location, wrong purchasing, wrong items, whatever. But we enjoyed ourselves together. I made of the people on the project. Of course, after the war, we literally scattered. Everybody went their own way. The younger people went back to school. The older people had to go around the country hunting for jobs. But I did keep up with the Cuevas, with Fernelius. I saw Ed Larson occasionally. I can remember Lou Marchi and his wife. We saw them once a few times. But in general, we scattered pretty much. So most of the names that I've given you, I haven't thought about them in years. A lot was going on actually right in Dayton that I didn't know about. You know, you get compartmentalized.
Sure.
there were Gunther Moore. He worked on a process. Henry Cleveland and I worked on an Orna process. And we had to make presentations to Ralph Meintz, who was the engineer. And Ralph selected the process that Henry and I worked on. I think it was because we talked his language. We talked about the amount of gas that might be produced. We talked about the size of filters, the depth of the precipitate on the filters, so forth. We talked Ralph Meintz's language, whereas the other team, oh yeah, there might be some gas produced. They were offhand about it. They didn't know the amount of precipitate or whatever it was they were working on. So I think they may have had the better process, but we had the better sales talk. So I remember Ralph chose whatever process Henry and I were working on. Did the guards check us as we came in? I suppose they did. I suppose we had passes of some kind. All I remember is the guards were always very amiable. I don't remember anything else about them. They had a little place to sit, as guards do. A little guardhouse.
Yeah.
Must have gone claustrophobic, little guard.
So you worked a regular 5-day week?
Yes, we worked regular civilian. It was like a real civilian operation. 8 to 5. Well, I can remember working around the clock one time. We were getting near the end of we had so many experiments to carry out. The number I remember is 25, and Sam and I worked on 21 and 22. I said to Sam, gee, there's only 2 to go. Let's do those 2. And we must have worked till early in the morning. But we were so tired we didn't do it correctly, and they had to redo them. But it was, we came and went. Essentially, it was an 8 to 5 job with hour lunch. Regular civilian operation. And I suppose that's what kept it so secret. It was just, everybody thought it was just another civilian operation, empty buildings, so they took it over.
Interesting.
A lot of companies had little things going on around the Dayton area. Dayton area was manufacturing area. There was the picric acid plant that I knew about. There must have been National Cash must have had a lot of little plants, so forth. Dayton must have been what? A couple 100,000, 300,000. So it had to be a lot going on. This was just another plant. That's probably why no one's ever heard of it. Your group, they said, everybody's heard a lot of that. Say, where's you work? Say, Dayton. Dayton? Well, it's in Dayton.